area veterans. Today there are, he has informed me, 167 profiles on their website. And that's quite a project, an ambitious project. He is also serving as a director on the board of the First Special Service Force Association. And it's that First Special Service Force in which his father served during the Second World War, when it was formed in the Second World War. And it was something I have to say I knew nothing about until Ted mentioned it to me. And so I'm looking forward to being very well informed this evening on an important piece of military history which has had a very long legacy and is still alive and well in our special forces today. So Ted, welcome this evening, and I would like you please to welcome Ted Morin for his talk this evening. Thank you.
I want to begin by saying that before I start my presentation, our daughter Christina is here with her husband Rob and our grandson Adam, and we also have the past president of the First Special Service Force Association, Don Shelton, and his wife Wendy. Let me begin by saying that I believe that every veteran deserves to have his story told. That's why I'm involved in the Lakefield War Veterans Project. To me, it's been quite a learning experience going back into World War I and researching what these men experienced in their times of service. But that really came after I decided to research the story of my father. 75 years ago, my father, Staff Sergeant E.F. Morin, was a prisoner of war in Stalag 7A in Germany. Like most veterans, he never spoke of his military experiences. But I knew, based on the men that came to visit us, that he had served and trained with a joint American and Canadian unit known as the First Special Service Force. Many years after his passing, I decided to research the force. And what I discovered of their exploits astonished me and revealed to me what my father had experienced and survived. To that end, I used that research and I wrote this document that's at the back of the hall. Our two daughters, Christina and Kate, who were both very young when he passed away, have said that without that document, they would have no memory of the grandfather. His story began July 3rd, 1940, when he enlisted in Peterborough with the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders. The SD&Gs trained in Peterborough, Kingston, and Ottawa. While in Ottawa, he was granted a leave from December 27, 1940 to January 14, 1941. He requested permission from his commanding officer to get married during his leave. Permission was granted. On January 7th, he married Rita Kelbrick at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Lindsay. That's a bit dark here, Don. I can't see my notes. I haven't written them in Braille.
Is that better?
That's better. Can you see? Oh.
Early spring, the SD&Gs moved to Camp de Bert in Nova Scotia near Truro, where their training continued. On July 21st, they embarked for England The training in England consisted of close order drills, lots of physical conditioning, long night marches, and battle inoculation exercises where live ammunition was fired around them and flash grenades and mines were exploded. These exercises were to get the men used to the sights and sounds of combat. My father would write, "The training is pretty tough. They are either going to make us or break us." They also trained in the use of the Lee Enfield rifle, Bren gun, and mortars. Records indicate that my father was considered qualified with these weapons. February 19th, 1942, he underwent a performance rating. It was said of my father, "Appearance and intelligence good, aggressive with a strong, pleasant personality. Would say he is a very good type and definitely MCO material. He refused another promotion a short time ago because he has lost interest in the infantry. He requested a transfer to the Royal Canadian Artillery, where he believes his interest will be revived and he will be a better fit." Early April, now a sergeant, he was on his way back to Canada as part of a prisoner of war escort detail bringing German prisoners to Canada for internment. When this duty was complete, he was assigned out west as a small arms instructor with the King's Own Rifles of Canada. In England, something was developing that would change the direction of his military service. An eccentric British military planner, Geoffrey Pike, had come up with a proposal to airdrop small, self-contained units, specially trained in winter warfare and demolition, into Norway, Romania, and northern Italy. There, using a mechanized snow machines, they would range across the countryside, blowing up key infrastructure targets. Winston Churchill and Lord Louis Mountbatten liked the proposal, but Britain didn't have the resources to develop it, and as such, it was handed over to the Americans. The proposal was now codenamed the Plow Project. General Marshall, the U.S. Chief of Staff, brought the project to the attention of General Eisenhower, who asked a young staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Frederick, to take a look at it. June 1st, Frederick concluded, the project is militarily unworkable. It is a suicide mission with little chance of success. Such small forces could not do sufficient enough damage to justify the risk and resources. Little thought had been given to the logistics of getting the men in and out, and no such mechanized snow machine existed. Plow was a beautiful paper concept, but a strategic farce. In spite of these findings, for political reasons, the Plow project continued. June 9th, at the urging of Mountbatten, Eisenhower gave Frederick command of the combat element of the project. June 11th, Mountbatten, Frederick, and Pike approached the Canadian government and military in Ottawa seeking their participation. The delegation received 100% support. Canada would supply 1/2 the officers and 1/3 of the enlisted men. The commitment was that all men would be volunteers, fully trained, and only the best available. When Frederick returned, Eisenhower told him to write his own orders. He gave himself the authority to go where he wanted, to get what or whoever he wanted, without interference from anyone. Marshall signed his orders on June 16th. An artillery officer by training with no previous combat command experience, he was now responsible for raising, training, and leading the unit into combat. He quickly had his key U.S. senior officers in place. The next step was to find a suitable place to train. Based on the secret status of the project and the nature of the training, the location had to have lots of room and privacy. It also had to be in close proximity to an environment and terrain, cold, snow, and mountains, that would approximate what they would encounter on the mission. Frederick found exactly what he was looking for at a Nidal National Guard base in Montana, Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena. On July 9, 1942, the 1st Special Service Force was officially activated. It was also on this day that Frederick was promoted to full colonel. Frederick, keenly aware of the dangers of the mission, had consulted a psychologist and was told that men already accustomed to the isolation of the wilderness would most likely excel in the mission. Recruitment notices now started going up in the U.S. The notices read, volunteers needed, single men between the ages of 21 and 35 years old who have completed 3 or more years of grammar school with experience within the occupation of lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, northwoodsmen, game wardens, prospectors, and explorers. The recruiting slogan was, vigorous training, hazardous duty. For those who measure up, get into the war quick. The men were expected to be robust and sturdy enough to undergo tough training, live under primitive conditions, and be able to endure the worst physical ordeals. In short order, U.S. junior officers and enlisted men started showing up in Montana. July 14th, the dispatch of 697 Canadian officers and other ranks to the U.S. was approved. On June 18th, recruitment notices went up at bases in Canada and England. Contrary to the old Army adage, never volunteer for anything, far more men stepped forward and volunteered than made it through the selection process. My father was one who stepped forward. Many men that volunteered were rejected for being married. My father was married, but he made it in. I've never figured that out. He was part of the 1st Canadian contingent to arrive in Montana on August 6, 1942, and was assigned to 3rd Company, 1st Regiment. With unit deployment planned for mid-December 1942, time was of the essence. Force conditioning was intense and rigorous. It was used to upgrade both the physical and mental endurance of the men for the mission, while weeding out those who were not up to the task. The day began at 4:45 a.m. and continued to 5:30 p.m., 6 days a week. The men engaged in a daily regimen of calisthenics, and he run through a specially designed 1.25 mile obstacle course. They also attended evening lectures on different aspects of warfare. The picture's hard to see, but in preparation for the ski training that was to come, the men marched across the Montana countryside with packs and long wooden poles. This is very difficult to see, but their pictures are in the photo album at the back. My father liked the U.S. Class A walking out enlisted man's uniform because it looked like a Canadian officer's uniform. This is a picture of a section. The section was the basic fighting unit of the force. Originally it was 10 men, and that would expand out to 14 or 16 men. Training was diverse and just as intense and rigorous as the physical conditioning. The men double-timed between each training session. If getting into the force was tough, staying in it was just as tough. As an example, recently, Herb Peppard from Truro, Nova Scotia said 95 of his men stepped forward and volunteered, and he was the only one accepted. It is estimated that 25% of those who went to Montana didn't complete the conditioning and training regimen. Force training consisted of parachute jumping, hand-to-hand combat and knife fighting, demolitions, weapons, both U.S. and German, rock climbing, skiing, cold weather living and night fighting, map reading, first aid, amphibious landings, and small unit assault tactics. The first training the men engaged in was parachute jumping. The normal 5-week training course had been compressed to 1 week. The men were shown the basics of exiting the plane, handling the harness, and how to land. After 1 week of practice, they made their first jump. Their second jump was made within 24 hours of the first. My father qualified as a parachutist on August 18th. Those who didn't jump or who were injured were immediately returned to their original units. When it came to rock climbing, the men would practice climbing up rock faces of various heights and steepness using their hands and ropes. My father would say the cliff appeared to go straight up 200 to 300 feet. Jumping out of a plane was easy. Rock climbing was scary. On September 26, 1942, the original mission was canceled. Force training continued while Frederick looked for a mission. October 28th, at the age of 23 years and 7 months, my father was promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant. To build up their endurance, they went on cross-country marches with full combat gear in all kinds of weather and terrain that ranged from 20 to 60 miles. It usually took a regiment 20 hours to complete a 60-mile march. Ski training took place under Norwegian Army ski instructors. The men lived in boxcars heated by 2 small stoves. The temperatures often ranged between minus 28 and minus 42 degrees Celsius. One veteran said that every morning they would get up out of the boxcar, stripped to the waist, and the man behind them would rub snow on their back. The idea was to get them used to the cold. At minus 32, I don't think it would take much. As you can tell from some of the positions of some of the men, this picture was taken early in the training. After 2 weeks of training per regiment, the instructor said that 99% of the forcemen would be considered competent as Norwegian ski troops. The men referred to their skis as the torture boards or the misery sticks. This is a section on a ski run. My father is second in line, and a Captain Borders is first. After the war, he told the story of Borders having, accompanied by his husky, Butch, having skied and snowshoed 1,200 miles from Fairbanks, Alaska, into British Columbia. My father said Borders expected us to ski like him. As far as weapons training was concerned, the force were expected to be proficient in all force weapons, which included the V-42 knife, .45 caliber pistol, M1 Grand rifle, Browning automatic rifle, Thompson submachine gun, Johnson light machine gun, Browning medium machine gun, bazooka, flamethrower, mortar, and the RS explosive. This picture of my mother and father was taken December 1942 while Rita was living in Helena. The training in Montana continued to April 6, 1943, when the force marched through Helena. It said that the entire town showed up for their departure. The men boarded trains which took them to Camp Bradford in Virginia, where they underwent extensive amphibious training. Before the force arrived, the best U.S. Army platoon took 60 seconds to disembark. The Marines held a record at 52 seconds. After 1 week, a force platoon did it in 33 seconds. The force now moved to Fort Ethan Allen in Vermont for training in small unit assault tactics. It was standard procedure for units prior to going overseas to go through a series of combat readiness assessments. 75% was considered acceptable. When the force went through their assessments, they achieved 125 to 150%, and in some cases 200%. These men were ready for whatever faced them. Late June 1943, the 1,200 men of force departed Vermont for San Francisco. The force was to be part of Operation Cottage, the invasion of Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. The men of the force were to lead the assault against an estimated 12,000 Japanese defenders who reported on the island. While boarding the ships in San Francisco, a port officer, with the bulky rucksacks they carried, the port officer commented, "A lot of troops have loaded out of here, and these are the heaviest packs I've seen. And the first troops that didn't stoop under their load, they look like real soldiers." That's a picture of the Aleutian Islands. You can't see it, but basically Kiska is actually a lot closer to Russia than it is to Alaska. This is a picture of the terrain that they faced on Kiska. The men of 1st Regiment, my father's unit, would land on August 15th. 3rd Regiment would land further up the island on August 16th. 2nd Regiment was held in reserve, ready to parachute in where and when they were needed. At midnight of August 15th, the men of 1st Regiment, laden down with 100-pound packs, boarded their rubber rafts and fighting tides and strong currents, paddled the 1 mile of open ocean towards their objectives. The first rafts hit shore around 1:30 a.m., but encountered no firing. Quickly forming into sections, they climbed up the dry creek bed and cliffs to the high ground surrounding the beaches. Still no firing. On the high ground, they took up defensive positions and waited to be attacked. Nothing happened. At dawn, patrols were sent out to find the enemy, but none were found. As a result of 3rd Regiment having the same experience, 2nd Regiment was ordered to stand down. It turns out the Japanese had abandoned the island prior to the assault. When the force landed back in San Francisco, half were given leave. My father was one who got a leave. He arrived back in Lindsay on September 9th, the day that I was born. Based on the circumstances, his leave was extended 4 days. It was now back to Fort Ethan Allen in Vermont. On October 14th, 1943, the men of the force embarked for North Africa. November 19th, they landed in Naples and joined Operation Raincoat, the Allied push up Italy. When the Allies decided to invade Italy, it had been described as the soft underbelly of Europe. Since landing in early September, they had discovered that Italy was, as one war correspondent described it, a tough old gut. They were facing a battle-hardened, determined enemy, occupying a series of well-prepared defensive positions in the mountains. That is a picture of my father taken the end of November 1943, and he's surrounded by the section. The first assignments given to the force were the capture of Monte La Defensa, Hill 960, and Monte La Remetania, Hill 907. Hill 368, which is mentioned later, is on the right. It's hard to work with not being able to see the slides. Prior to the force arrival, a number of assaults had been made on Defensa from the south side, but all had failed with very heavy casualties. Colonel Frederick and the 2nd Regiment officers scouted out the situation and decided that the force would assault Defensa from the north side. They would climb the steep incline and sheer cliffs during the night and assault the enemy from above and behind. 2nd Regiment was given the assignment. December 1st, 1943, 2nd Regiment began a 10-mile march at night through the mud and rain to the base of Defensa. 1st Regiment moved out an hour after to take up a position on Hill 368. December 3rd, following an Allied artillery barrage and having made the climb through the dark and rain, the men of 1st Battalion, 2nd Regiment reached the top of Defensa. At 6 a.m., all hell broke loose as the battle was engaged. In only 2 hours of very heavy, close combat, the hill was taken. The men now hunkered down for 2 days in the rain and fog, anticipating a German counterattack and enduring enemy artillery and mortar barrages. 2nd Battalion, 2nd Regiment was now brought up to join the battle. They carried 75 to 100-pound packs of ammunition, extra weapons, and supplies. The evening of December 3rd, 1st Regiment had been ordered to start moving towards Defensa. Almost immediately, they encountered German snipers firing tracer rounds. An enemy artillery observer on another hill called in an artillery barrage where the tracer rounds crossed. Caught in the open, 1st Regiment suffered 240 casualties, 40%. 1st Battalion, 1st Regiment, reformed, closed ranks, and moved on up to Defensa as ordered. After the war, my father said that as they started to climb up Defensa, Borders said to him, "You go further on guts than you do on brawn." Captain Borders was killed December 6, 1943, on Defensa, shot in the head by a German sniper. Captain Borders was the first of 4 company commanders whom my father served that were killed in combat. There is no explanation as to why some men survived and other men died, especially when they were side by side in combat. When 1st Battalion, 1st Regiment reached the top of Defensa, they, along with 2nd Regiment, made a combined assault on Remetania. During its first 6 days in combat, the force suffered 511 casualties, 73 dead, 9 missing, 313 wounded or injured, and 116 cases of exhaustion. Most of the cases of exhaustion occurred in 3rd Regiment and the Service Battalion, who were used to carry supplies up and casualties down. It often took 8 men 12 hours to move a single casualty from the top of Defensa. Over the next 35 days, the men of the force assaulted one mountaintop stronghold after another. During this time, they encountered ice, snow, and gale force winds. In spite of being tired, hungry, wet, and cold, and taking continuously higher casualty rates, they persevered and took every objective assigned to them. To keep their objectives, they faced German counterattacks. And when their own ammunition supply ran low, they used captured enemy weapons. But their success came at a high cost. Of the 1,800 men who went into the mountains on December 1st, 1943, when they came out, 1,400 were dead or hospitalized. Of the 600 men in 1st Regiment, 7 officers and 82 enlisted men were shown as effectives, able to continue in combat. The rest were casualties. My father was one of the 82. The force now moved back to its base at Santa Maria, where they luxuriated in hot showers, warm buildings, and hot food. They also went back to training. Winston Churchill had become frustrated with the slow progress of the push of Italy and had lobbied for an amphibious landing along the coast. He reasoned, if we can't go through the Germans, why not go around? Against opposition, he eventually had his way. And on June 22nd, 1944, 36,000 Allied troops landed on Anzio. Although the Germans were initially caught by surprise, within days the beachhead was surrounded by 70,000 German troops. The slides here are now completely out of sequence. I'm not sure what's happening. On February 2nd, the force landed on Anzio and took up a position on the right side of the front line facing the Mussolini Canal. With only 68 officers and 1,165 men, they were assigned 13 kilometers. In the mountains, the men of the force had proven their fighting ability. It was at Anzio that they would become a legend. The day they arrived, Brigadier General Frederick assessed the situation and concluded, with the enemy only 150 yards away on the other side of the Mussolini Canal, the time had come to kick them out of the front yard. With its force spread dangerously thin along the line, he concluded that the best defense was to keep the Germans off balance with aggressive night patrols. On the first night, a number of force patrols pushed across the canal and into German-held territory, eliminating enemy outposts as they moved forward. In a little over a week, through their aggressive efforts, they had pushed the Germans back 1,500 to 2,000 meters, creating a somewhat fluid no man's land in front of the front line. February 15th, following a firefight, a diary was found on the body of a dead German officer. An entry on February 11th referenced a raid on Sassuolo by the Black Devils. Another entry on the 13th referenced another attack. We never hear the devils come. They are all around us. That slide is the picture of the men putting on black boot polish before they went out on patrols. I guess they put on a little too much. My father would say that he preferred the residue from burnt wine corks, as it was easier to get off. German prisoners would state they were afraid of the night because when darkness came, so did the Black Devils. A prisoner was found to have a note on him from German headquarters which said, "You are fighting an elite Canadian and American unit. They are treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. You cannot relax. A 10-day pass will be given to anyone who captures one of these devils." A slide that actually appears. Following the night patrols, the men would leave behind calling cards on the demolished German outposts and the dead bodies. Translated, they said, "The worst is yet to come." My father was hospitalized from March 6th to March 26th for an unspecified reason. On May 9th, after 98 days of continuous night patrols and manning the front line without relief, the men of the force were withdrawn. Having been tasked with leading the breakout from Anzio, the force had been brought back up to full combat strength. It was also back to training and physical conditioning. As a colonel or as a brigadier general, in the mountains or on Anzio, in the thick of battle or scouting out no man's land, Frederick was always where his men were. For his actions, the men of the force thought the world of Frederick. A forceman said, "We would have followed him into hell." In many respects, they did. It is reported he was the most shot at and wounded Allied officer in the Second World War. He was awarded 8 Purple Hearts for being wounded and numerous other decorations for bravery and courage. Churchill would say, "With a dozen more generals like him, we could have smashed Hitler in 42. He is the greatest fighting general of all times." It's hard to describe. That is a picture of the breakout that was planned. The first of there was the jump-off point, then there was Highway 7, and then there was the railway embankment. At dawn, May 23rd, following an Allied artillery barrage, the men of 1st Battalion, 1st Regiment, started moving across open ground, silencing enemy opposition with grenades and automatic weapon fire. The further they went, the tougher the opposition became. Taking heavy casualties, they continued to advance. By 10 a.m., parts of 1st and 3rd Companies were across Highway 7. 2nd Company remained to block the highway while the remnants moved on to the railway embankment where they dug in. At 12:30, they were hit with an artillery barrage. Unfortunately, their advance had been so rapid that the unit on their left had been unable to keep up, leaving the entire flank exposed. At approximately 3 p.m., heavy German tanks, backed up by infantry, came at them from the left. The remnants of 1st and 3rd Companies remained dug in on the embankment. Armed only with light weapons and almost out of ammunition, with no way of being resupplied or withdraw, the men were in a desperate situation. Eventually, a group of Tiger tanks moved in on a pocket of 17 men and gave them 90 seconds to surrender or be wiped out. My father was one who surrendered. Although his days in combat were over, the fight of the force went on. At 6:25 a.m., June 4th, 1944, a force patrol entered Rome and in so doing became the first Allied troops to enter the Eternal City. There is more to tell about the exploits of the force, but for now, my presentation focuses on my father's experiences. It is said the captured men were marched virtually non-stop for 3 days and nights. The march was described as a death march. Those who couldn't keep up or who fell out were shot. Of the 100 men who started the march, 50 made it to Rome, where they were shipped off to Germany. Early in the march, my father's left foot started to swell significantly and gave him a lot of pain. Knowing what the alternative was, he kept his jump boot tightly laced and kept marching. When he arrived at the prison camp, they operated on his foot and removed a piece of clamshell which had become infected. My mother now received this telegram. I can only surmise how she felt, living in Lindsay with an 8-month-old baby, when she received this telegram indicating that Eddie was missing in action and wondering whether he was alive. There would have been a lot of tears. I'm sure she would have felt some relief when she received this telegram indicating that he was a prisoner of war, but still concerned about what his condition was. Shortly after, she received a letter from Eddie, which stated he was a prisoner in German captivity, that he was in perfect health, and that he expected to be moved to another camp where he'd be able to receive and reply to letters. She next received a letter stating that he had been moved to Stalag 7A. In these letters, among other things, he would inquire about everyone's health and the weather. He would ask about plans for Christmas, that he would miss midnight mass and dinner with the family. He would also ask everyone to write him often. He would say that things were not too bad, except for the fact that he was behind barbed wire, and as such didn't get around much, and didn't have any news. He would also say that he was in good health, and not to worry. Initially, he would reference receiving a Red Cross parcel and 50 cigarettes a week. This would change to half a Red Cross parcel and 15 cigarettes a week. He then mentioned that he had to take his belt in a couple of notches and grin and bear it. Finally, he would write, "Things haven't been going so well around here for the past few weeks, as we have not received a Red Cross parcel and no cigarettes." He now began to mention he often dreamed of the meals that he used to have at home, and hoping that it wouldn't be long before he could have another. That picture is a mass of men sitting on a Sherman tank. After 335 days as a prisoner of war, my father received his freedom when the camp was liberated on April 29, 1945, by Combat Command A of the 14th U.S. Armored Division. I'm sure my mother would have been quite when she received this telegram from Eddie saying that he was safe in England. After spending a month in a British hospital, my father arrived back in Canada on June 22nd, 1945. I'm told his arrival caused a lot of excitement. The picture on the left is of my father after he arrived home. I'm still amazed at how small the tunic is that he was wearing. But then I remember he only weighed 98 pounds when he was freed. The tunic is on the back table. My father was discharged from the Canadian Army on August 21st, 1945. The picture on the right is of my father and I sharing a special moment. I am quite sure that I have no idea of the significance of the moment. This is a picture of my father with Major General Robert T. Frederick, retired, that was taken at the 1968 Ontario premiere of the movie The Devils Brigade. I have many good memories of time spent with my father while I was growing up, until he passed away December 24th, 1977, at the age of 58. September 27, 2012, almost 35 years after my father's passing, the Lakefield Historical Society honored his military service with a collage that it had commissioned. The event was well attended, and many key people came forward with stories of my father. I was in awe of the legacy that remained behind with the people in the village where my father had grew up. it was said that he was known around the village as being extremely modest, quiet, and reserved. A veteran said Eddie Morin was the ultimate soldier. Now for a brief wrap-up of the story of the 1st Special Service Force. On August 15, 1944, almost to the hour of their first landing, the men of the force landed on 2 islands of the Heries off the south coast of France. Reconnaissance of the islands indicated that due to the steep incline and sheer cliffs on the south side, no German lookouts were posted. As it was with the Fenza, this is exactly where the men of the force came ashore. After securing the islands, the men landed on the mainland on August 21st, 1944. As part of Operation Dragoon, an Allied airborne and amphibious assault on the south coast of France. Because of the location of this campaign along the Riviera coast, it is often referred to as the Champagne Campaign, but there was nothing easy about it. Over the next month and a half, the men of the force fought a number of grueling engagements, liberating villages and seizing mountaintop strongholds while keeping constant pressure on the retreating Germans as they marched towards the French-Italian border, where by the end of October, the force took up a static position. On November 28th, they were withdrawn from combat and moved to a bivouac area near Villeneuve-Loubert. On December 5th, 1944, the men formed up on the flats of the Lou River near Metten, France. Unknowing to the men, the U.S. and Canadian military establishment had decided that the war had become too large for a small tactical assault unit. The chaplain read a prayer for those who had died in this last campaign to join the names of the honored dead from previous campaigns. The colors of United States, Canada, and the force were brought forward. The force flag was slowly lowered, wound to its shaft, and the casing slipped over it. The Canadians were called off the field, were called forward and marched off the field behind the Canadian flag. The Americans, contrary to military tradition, did not fill in the gaps created by their departing comrade in arms. They had long since forgotten who were Americans and who were Canadians. After 251 days in combat, the force had suffered a casualty rate of 135%. On February 3rd, 2015, with bipartisan support, the 114th U.S. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the 1st Special Service Force as a unit for its superior service in World War II. Many politicians and military men extolled the virtue, the bravery, the courage, and the sacrifice of the men of the force during their time in combat. For those who are interested, there is a small display at the back with the tunic and document that I made reference to, a picture album, and some pamphlets on the force that you're welcome to. Thank you for listening to me tell my father's story and that of the 1st Special Service Force.
much, Ted. Will you take questions? Sure. Good, thank you. Are there any questions?
What was your father's opinion of the accuracy, historical accuracy of the movie?
He said it was good. He said it was good Hollywood entertainment. He took strong exception to the depiction of the Americans as being drunken, undisciplined louts. I have a hard time watching the movie. Every time I watch it, my wife just says, watch the movie, no side comment. Because there is so much in it that is embellished and inaccurate. It's painful to watch, from my perspective.
Is there a regimental museum or anything that, since it's disbanded, is there anything where the last colors are held and that kind of thing?
There is a museum in Montana. There's a small display in Halifax in the Citadel. There's a display in Ottawa in the War Museum. There's action presently underway to put together a presentation at the Calgary War Museum. I'm not sure of any other ones.
Ted, I was interested in your comments after your dad was liberated from the camp and brought back to England. My dad went through a similar experience. And it's a gap in terms of how the armed forces dealt with men who had been under severe conditions. I'm not sure they fully understood the PTS issues and what kind of, if your dad at all mentioned or if you were able to find, what kind of support, transition to civilian life did the men undergo during that transition period when they were liberated?
None. I was very lucky to have had the father that I had, because he didn't exhibit a lot of the stuff that other men came back. Men came back, they were heavy drinkers, they became abusive, aggressive, panic attacks. They were broken men, and there was no support for them. Some of the family members that I have met, one in particular, he was a decorated war hero. He received the Silver Star for saving a man's life on defensive. He saved another man on a night patrol on Amseo, in which my father was with. He returned back to Canada, to a small town. He became a drunk. He was abusive. And he took his own life. And his relatives, specifically his son, can't get past what his life was with him. It was very sad. I mean, these men experienced stuff that no human being should ever have to experience. I mean, they killed men with their bare hands. They killed men with their daggers. They held the men while the blood and life bled from them. They did this for us out of a sense of duty. And when they got back, there was nothing for them. So I was lucky. Many weren't. I met a woman at the Peterborough reunion. The only memory she has of her father is when she was 3 years old, and her father is standing there in his force uniform, and she's holding his hand. I had my father to 58 years old. So for that, I'm thankful. Just as a comment, the reference to the Devils Brigade, I have a problem with that designation. I've done a lot of research into the force, and as best as I can establish, the term, the Devils Brigade, became fashionable in the mid-50s, and then was picked up for a title for a book, The Devils Brigade, and then moved on to the movie. I can find no reference to the Germans ever referring to them as the Devils Brigade. They did refer to them as the Black Devils. They also referred to them as the men with the dirty face and baggy pants, because they wore special mountain pants with lots of pockets in it. But I've never found any reference to the Devils Brigade. Esther.
Just wondering if you could comment on the present-day lineage. The 1st Special Service Force was disbanded in, like you said, in '44, December 5th. And has that lineage been continued with present-day Canadian and U.S. military forces?
The Green Berets were the first unit to pick up the legacy of the 1st Special Service Force in the United States. Then it came across to Canada, and there was a somewhat, the Canadian Airborne picked up the legacy of the force until it was disbanded. Then the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, CSOR, is presently in existence in Peterborough, and they trace their direct military heritage back to the 1st Special Service Force. In fact, there is a Frederick Gate at Peterborough. The men of the CSOR actually wear replica dress uniforms of the Second World War forcemen. They are a tough bunch. I've met a few of them, and serious dudes they are. But the interesting thing about it is they are absolutely amazed at what these men accomplished in the Second World War, having gone through the training that they presently go through. They can't figure out how these men did it. So the legacy of the force is living on in the special forces around the United States and Canada.
Just wondered about the administration of the force, when you've got 2 countries involved. How did that, things like pay and leave, and was that a complete schmozzle, or was it somehow organized?
That's a The administration of the 1st Special Service Force was quite difficult for both Canada and the United States, because it was a unique force that had never been put together before. You had Americans reporting to Canadian officers, Canadians reporting to American officers. The Canadians followed the Canadian disciplinary procedures, while the Americans followed the Americans. On the pay issue, that's a particularly sore point. My father, as a staff sergeant, made less money than an American private. Frederick wanted both groups to be paid the same way. The Canadian administration, in their wisdom, failed to recognize the uniqueness of the force and refused to give them equal pay. Just imagine, you're about to come out of a plane, and the man jumping in front of you is making twice as much as you are. This was a sore point with my father till the day he passed away. But he described it away by saying, we were better crap shooters than they were. That equaled out the pay.
What about the pension? Would that be even or not?
My father was not well treated from a pension standpoint after his service. In 1968, he was diagnosed with 3 blocked arteries in his heart. And after going through a number of tests, the physicians indicated that the condition was primarily due to his training, his time overseas, and in the prison camp. We received, or he received, no consideration for the condition.
Not much has changed.
No,
No. I have a question about your sources. You have a wonderfully personal, humane story to tell of your father. And it suggests to me you've got sources which may not have come directly from him orally, because you said he was rather reserved. So there must be documentary sources. You mentioned some letters, correspondence. What other sources do you use to get at these really intimate insights you have into your father?
I read a lot. I think I've read every book published on the force. I've watched every documentary on the force. I spend a lot of time exploring and going down wormholes on the internet, searching out anything that I can find on the force, and you find just little trinkets here and there, but it's just a lot of reading. And I just read a book on Anzio. It's 347 pages long, and I was reading along, and here is one brief, very short paragraph on an interview with Frederick while we were on Anzio that I have not seen in any other book. So it's just constant research.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you again, Ted, for your wonderfully personal and humane story. It's a very touching story, but also one that reminds us of how beneficial we are to have had people like your father and that generation looking out for our best interests.
Yeah.
Thank you very much on behalf of the There's a display at the back that table that Ted has put up here.
And most-
which I'm going to look at.
Yeah, some of the pictures are in the display, so.
I do apologize for the technology. Those pictures are very clear on one screen, but not on another. Don, we're going to have to get a more powerful projector, I think.
Time for a new projector.
Yeah.